The F-22 Raptor sat on the tarmac like a loaded gun, 30 tons of classified titanium. Beyond the red security rope, a woman in a faded denim jacket reached out to touch the landing gear. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like a tired mother. Security moved in anyway. The heat coming off the tarmac at Langley was a physical weight. It smelled of melting asphalt, synthetic oil, and the sharp chemical tang of JP-8 jet fuel. To most people, it was an industrial wasteland. To Sarah, it was the only place that had ever felt like home. She walked with a slight limp, favoring her left knee. Decades of climbing up boarding ladders, the brutal compression of 9 Gs on her spine, and one particularly ugly ejection over a hostile desert had left her body a roadmap of localized arthritis. She wore scuffed brown boots, a pair of worn-in Levi's, and an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. Her hair, streaked heavily with gray, was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian knot. She carried no badge. She had no escort. Today was a base open house. The civilian crowds were kept a mile away, penned in behind barricades to watch the Thunderbirds loop through the July haze. But Hangar 4 was restricted. It was an operational flight line. Active birds. No cameras, no civilians, no exceptions. Sarah hadn't cared. She had simply bypassed the checkpoint while the gate guards were busy arguing with a vendor about a missing manifest. She knew the blind spots in the camera coverage. She knew exactly how to walk with the kind of bored, invisible purpose that made people assume she belonged. She stopped in front of tail number 044. The F-22 Raptor sat in the ambient gloom of the hangar. It was a jagged wedge of engineered violence, completely stripped of humanity. It didn't look like a plane. It looked like a scalpel. Sarah exhaled, the sound loud in the cavernous space. She stepped over the thick red line painted on the concrete. Across the hangar, Airman First Class Miller was sweating under his Kevlar vest. He was 21 years old, 9 months out of training, and heavily caffeinated. His primary job today was to stand by the heavy blast doors and ensure none of the open house tourists wandered into the restricted zone to take a selfie with a $100 million government asset. He blinked, wiped a bead of sweat from his eye. There was a woman standing under the starboard wing of OR-4. Miller's stomach dropped. He keyed his radio, his thumb slipping slightly on the plastic casing. "Command, this is Post 3. I have an unauthorized individual in Hangar 4, moving to intercept." "Copy, Post 3, the radio crackled. "Identify and detain. Do not approach alone if the subject appears hostile." "Hostile?" Miller looked at her. She was a middle-aged woman staring at a strut. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't carrying anything at all. But protocol was protocol. This was a priority A resource. You didn't just wander up to a stealth fighter. Miller unclipped the retention strap on his holster. He didn't draw his weapon, but his hand hovered over the grip. He closed the distance quickly, his combat boots slapping against the polished concrete. "Ma'am!" Miller shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "Ma'am, step away from the aircraft! Now!" Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even turn around. She reached out, her fingers trailing lightly over the dark, matte gray skin of the fuselage just above the weapons bay. The material felt rough, like fine grit sandpaper. It was designed to absorb radar waves, to make the jet invisible. She traced a faint, almost imperceptible groove in the coating. She remembered the day that groove got there. a bird strike on takeoff out of Elmendorf, the sickening thud, the immediate cascade of warning lights flashing across the multifunction displays in the cockpit, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding her mouth as she fought the heavy, sluggish controls to bring the 30-ton brick back to the runway before the starboard engine swallowed its own turbine blades. "Hey, I said back away!" Miller was 10 feet away now. His hand was firmly on his sidearm. His pulse was hammering in his throat. He had never actually arrested anyone before. He had broken up a fight outside a bar off base, but this was a national security breach. Sarah slowly dropped her hand. She turned to look at the young airman. She took in the white knuckles, the wide, panicked eyes, the aggressive stance. She sighed. It wasn't a sigh of fear. It was the bone-deep, exhausted sigh of a woman dealing with a broken washing machine. "Relax, airman," Sarah said. Her voice was low, raspy from years of breathing pure oxygen through a mask. "I'm just looking." "You are in a restricted area, ma'am," Miller barked, trying to inject authority into a voice that wanted to crack. "Place your hands on your head and interlock your fingers. Do it now." Sarah looked from Miller to the jet, then back to Miller. "You've got a hydraulic leak on the main gear actuator," she noted casually, pointing a thumb over her shoulder. "Puddling on the deck. Might want to call maintenance before it strips the paint." Miller blinked, entirely derailed. He glanced instinctively at the landing gear, then snapped his attention back to her, furious at himself for looking. "Hands on your head!" he yelled, drawing his M9 pistol and keeping it pointed at a low ready, aiming at her knees. "I am not asking again." Sarah looked at the gun. She didn't raise her hands. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped, staring at the weapon with absolute infuriating boredom. "Safety's still on, kid," she said quietly. Miller's thumb instinctively twitched toward the safety lever, his face flushing violently red. He felt profoundly stupid, and stupid men with guns were the most dangerous kind. "Command, I need backup at Hangar 4 right now," Miller yelled into his shoulder mic, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Subject is non-compliant. On the ground, ma'am. Get on the concrete." Sarah watched his hands tremble. She knew the physiology of panic. She had seen it in the eyes of wingmen who lost their spatial awareness at 40,000 feet. She knew that if she moved too quickly, the kid might actually pull the trigger. "All right, take it easy," she said. She moved deliberately, telegraphing every motion. She dropped to her knees, wincing audibly as her left knee hit the unforgiving concrete. She placed her hands slowly on the back of her head, interlocking her fingers. The rough concrete bit into her skin. She smelled the dust, and the lingering exhaust fumes pooled near the floor. The hangar doors groaned as a base security vehicle tore through the entrance, its blue and red lights bouncing off the walls and flashing wildly against the matte gray skin of the F-22. The tires screeched to a halt 50 yards away. 2 more heavily armed security forces personnel piled out, rifles at the ready. "Keep her covered, Miller," one of them shouted, sprinting across the hangar. This one was older, a staff sergeant. Name tape read, Davis. Davis moved with practiced, aggressive efficiency. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's right wrist, wrenching it down from her head and twisting it sharply behind her back. Sarah let out a sharp hiss of breath. "Watch the shoulder," she gritted out. "Rotator cuff is shot." "Shut up," Davis ordered. He slammed a heavy knee between her shoulder blades, pinning her to the concrete. It was an excessive application of force. Sarah knew it. They were treating a middle-aged woman in a sweater like an active saboteur. But she didn't fight back. Fighting back got you shot. She let her body go completely limp, offering dead weight, a tactic she'd learned in SEER school. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Make them do the work. Davis snapped heavy plastic zip ties around her wrists, pulling them tight enough to instantly cut off the circulation. The sharp plastic dug into her skin. "Subject is secure," Davis called out, breathing heavily. He hauled her to her feet by her arms. Sarah groaned, her bad knee buckling slightly before she found her footing. She looked at Davis. He was glaring at her, treating her with the specific kind of contempt reserved for civilian protesters who chain themselves to base gates. "You want to tell me how the hell you got past the flight line perimeter, lady?" Davis demanded, getting in her face. He smelled of chewing tobacco and cheap cologne. "I walked," Sarah said, mildly. "You walked," Davis mocked. "Right past 3 checkpoints, 2 K9 units, and a locked perimeter fence. Who are you working for? You trying to make a statement?" "I was looking at the airplane, Sergeant." "It's a classified weapons system, not a museum exhibit," Davis snapped. He grabbed her shoulder and shoved her toward the hood of the security vehicle. "Search her." Miller approached, holstering his weapon. He patted down her jacket pockets. He found a set of car keys, a half-empty pack of peppermint gum, and a heavy, worn leather wallet. Miller opened the wallet. He fumbled through it. No press badge, no protest pamphlets, just a Virginia driver's license. "Name's Sarah Jennings," Miller read aloud, squinting at the small print in the flashing strobe lights of the cruiser. "Civilian address in Alexandria." "Run her," Davis ordered, keeping a heavy hand pressed against the back of Sarah's neck, pinning her face against the warm hood of the vehicle. "See if she's on any watch lists." Sarah turned her head slightly against the metal, resting her cheek on the hood. She looked past Davis's bulky tactical vest, staring back at the F-22 in the shadows. The jet looked entirely indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath its wings. It was just metal, wires, and code. It didn't care who flew it, and it didn't care who bled for it. "Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice muffled against the hood, "you might want to ease up on the zip ties. My fingers are going numb, and I need them." "You don't need them for a holding cell, ma'am." "I need them to sign your commander's reprimand," she replied, her tone utterly devoid of humor. Davis laughed harshly. "Lady, you are looking at federal charges. Trespassing on a military installation, breaching a restricted zone, espionage, suspicion. You aren't signing anything but a confession." A heavy silence settled over the radio net. Then, the dispatch operator's voice crackled through the speaker on Davis's vest. "Post 3, be advised. Base commander is en route to your location." He heard the radio traffic. "Wants a sit rep." Davis stood up straighter, instinctively checking his uniform. "Copy that. We have the suspect detained. Area is secure." He hauled Sarah up off the hood, turning her around to face the entrance of the hangar. "Stand up straight. No talking when the old man gets here. You understand me?" Sarah didn't answer. She just looked at the hangar entrance. A black, unmarked SUV rolled smoothly through the open doors, moving much slower than the security cruiser. It pulled up a few yards away and threw it into park. The engine cut out. The hangar was dead quiet, save for the low hum of the portable floodlights and the rhythmic clicking of the cooling engine blocks. The driver's side door opened. Colonel Robert Hayes stepped out onto the concrete. He was a tall man, impeccably pressed in his blues, his chest heavy with ribbons. He had the hard, weathered face of a man who had spent his youth dropping ordnance in the desert and his middle age fighting bureaucrats in the Pentagon. Hayes looked at the flashing lights. He looked at Davis and Miller, both standing at rigid attention. Then he looked at the woman in the oversized sweater, her hands bound behind her back, her face smudged with dust from the hood of the cruiser. Hayes stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy, authoritative scowl on the colonel's face vanished. It was replaced by a look of profound, absolute shock. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He didn't look at the security guards. He didn't look at the multi-million-dollar jet. He just stared at the woman in zip ties. "Colonel," Davis started, his voice ringing out loudly in the quiet hangar. "Sir, we apprehended this civilian trespassing on the—" "Shut up, Sergeant," Hayes said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the air like a razor. Davis snapped his mouth shut, confused. Hayes took a slow step forward. His eyes locked on Sarah. He looked at the plastic restraints digging into her wrists. He looked at the dust on her cheek. "Sir, she—" Miller tried. "I said shut your mouth," Hayes snapped, not looking away from Sarah. He walked right past the guards. He stopped 2 feet in front of Sarah. The silence in the hangar stretched, thick and suffocating. The 2 security guards exchanged a nervous glance, suddenly realizing that they had stepped into something much deeper and much more dangerous than a simple trespassing violation. Sarah looked up at the colonel. Her expression hadn't changed. She looked tired, cynical, and deeply unimpressed. "Hey, Bobby," she said quietly. Colonel Hayes swallowed hard. "Cut those ties off her," he ordered. Davis blinked. "Sir? She's an unauthorized—" Hayes finally turned his head, locking eyes with the staff sergeant. The fury in the commander's eyes was absolute. "Sergeant, you are currently holding the woman who pulled my burning ass out of the sky over Baghdad in '03, Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "That is not a civilian." He pointed a rigid finger at the tired woman in the sweater. "That's Falcon." The heavy silence in the hangar felt brittle enough to snap. Staff Sergeant Davis froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly mottled gray beneath the harsh fluorescent halogens. He looked at the plastic ties biting into the woman's wrists, then up at Colonel Hayes. "Sir," Davis stammered. The aggressive bark was gone. He sounded like a panicked child. "She didn't have clearance. She wasn't carrying ID. I told you to cut them off," Hayes repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He took a single step toward the staff sergeant, invading his personal space. "If I have to say it a third time, Sergeant, you will be pulling gate duty in Thule, Greenland, until your pension vests. Get the shears." Davis scrambled. He fumbled wildly at his tactical vest, tearing at the Velcro flap of his medical pouch. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the heavy trauma shears onto the concrete. They hit with a sharp, echoing clatter. Miller, looking thoroughly sick to his stomach, stood paralyzed near the front bumper of the cruiser. Davis snatched up the shears. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling it slightly to angle the blades beneath the tight plastic. "Careful," Hayes warned, a low, dangerous growl. The thick plastic gave way with a sharp crack. Sarah let her arms drop. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't wince, though deep red gouges circled her pale skin, already beginning to bruise a dark purple. She just rolled her shoulders backward, hearing the familiar, wet popping of damaged cartilage. Hayes watched her. The anger melted off him, replaced by a heavy, profound exhaustion. He took his garrison cap off, running a hand through thinning gray hair. "You always did have a terrible habit of ignoring perimeter protocols, Sarah," Hayes said. Sarah finally offered a small, crooked smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Only when the perimeter is stupid, Bobby." Davis took a hesitant step back, trying to shrink into the heavy shadows cast by the F-22's massive wingspan. "Colonel," he whispered, entirely out of his depth. "Who is she?" Hayes didn't look at the guard. He kept his eyes fixed on Sarah. "April 2003, Hayes said, his voice carrying the flat, detached cadence of a man reciting a casualty report. "I was flying an A-10 low over the Karbala Gap. Took a surface-to-air missile in the right engine. Fire suppression failed. I was going down in hostile territory, bleeding hydraulic fluid, with 2 Republican Guard mechanized units waiting for me to hit the dirt." Hayes finally turned his head, fixing Davis with a dead, hollow stare. Major Jennings was flying top cover in an F-16. She was bingo fuel. She had every operational right to head back to base. Instead, she dropped down to the deck. She flew so low she was taking small arms fire through her canopy. She laid down 2,000 rounds of 20mm depleted uranium, walked it right across those mechanized units, and cleared a landing zone. She circled my burning wreck until combat search and rescue arrived. Hayes looked back at Sarah. The silence in the hangar was absolute. "She flew back to Kuwait on fumes," Hayes finished quietly. "Dead stick landed. Engine flamed out on the runway because her tanks were completely dry. She traded her jet for my life." Miller stared at the woman in the oversized sweater, the woman he had pointed a loaded M9 pistol at 5 minutes ago. His mouth hung open. Sarah sighed, shifting her weight off her bad knee. "You exaggerate, Bobby. I had at least 10 seconds of fuel left." "I read the maintenance report, Sarah. You brought back a glider." Sarah looked past Hayes, her eyes drifting back to the F-22 Raptor. "Tail number 04 Trl. "I didn't come here to trade war stories," she said. "Why did you come?" Hayes asked. "The open house is a mile that way. You could have called my office. I would have driven you down here myself, cleared the hangar, brought coffee. I didn't want the VIP treatment." Sarah shoved her hands into the pockets of her worn denim jacket. "I didn't want the salutes, the handshakes, the thank you for your service routine. I just wanted to see her." Hayes followed her gaze to the jet. It was a machine born in the early 2000s, designed to dominate skies that no longer existed, but it was still the deadliest thing in the air. "You were the first squadron commander for the 27th Fighter Squadron when they transitioned to the Raptors," Hayes noted softly. "This was your bird." "She was," Sarah said. She walked past Hayes. She ignored Davis and Miller completely. To her, they were just furniture. She stepped over the red restriction line again, walking right back to the spot she had been occupying when Miller first drew his weapon. Sarah stood under the massive angled nose of the fighter. She reached up. She didn't trace the skin this time. She just rested her palm flat against the cold composite material. Hayes walked up beside her. He signaled to the 2 security guards with a sharp flick of his wrist. "Get out!" Davis and Miller didn't hesitate. They climbed into the cruiser, leaving the flashing lights off, and threw it into reverse. The engine idled quietly as they backed out of the hangar, desperately trying to erase their own presence. "They're going to write her off, aren't they?" Sarah asked. Hayes shoved his hands into his uniform pockets. He looked at the floor. "Next year. The Block 20s are too expensive to upgrade. Congress won't approve the funding to bring them up to Block 30 standards. They're going to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan, chopped up for scrap or baked in the Arizona sun." Sarah nodded slowly. It wasn't a surprise. She understood the brutal calculus of the military-industrial complex. You build $1 billion weapon, you run it into the ground, and when the software outgrows the hardware, you throw it away. "It's funny," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You give them everything. You let them compress your spine until you can't sleep on a mattress. You breathe in toxic fumes until your lungs sound like crumpled paper. You let them wire you into a machine until you forget where the metal ends and your own nervous system begins." She patted the cold side of the jet. "And then they just throw you in the desert." Hayes watched her. He knew she wasn't just talking about the airplane. Sarah Jennings had been a prodigy. The first woman to command an F-22 combat squadron. A lethal, cold-blooded tactician in the air and a fiercely loyal commander on the ground. She had flown in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. She had dropped ordnance in pitch-black valleys and chased Russian bombers out of Alaskan airspace. But the human body was not designed to pull 9 times the force of gravity. It was not designed to sustain that level of violent kinetic trauma over a 20-year career. 3 years ago, during a routine training flight, Sarah's left knee had simply given out. A complex tear of the ACL and meniscus, exacerbated by profound osteoarthritis in her lower lumbar spine. The medical review board had grounded her permanently. They didn't give her a desk job. They gave her a medical discharge, a bronze plaque, and a pension. She had gone from apex predator to civilian in the space of a Thursday afternoon. "How is civilian life treating you, Sarah?" Hayes asked. It was a stupid question, but he had to ask it. "I manage a hardware store in Alexandria," she said deadpan. "Yesterday, a guy spent 20 minutes screaming at me because we were out of 3/4-inch PVC couplings. I stood there and took it." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I used to drop 1,000-pound JDAMs through the roofs of terrorist safe houses. Now I apologize to accountants about plumbing supplies." Hayes closed his eyes. The tragedy of it was heavy, suffocating. "You should have called, Sarah. You shouldn't be out there alone." "I'm not alone. I have a golden retriever. He doesn't care about my combat record. And he doesn't flag me with a 9mm when I walk into the kitchen." She turned away from the jet. The movement was stiff. The adrenaline from the encounter with the guards was fading, and her joints were screaming. The concrete floor felt like ice radiating up through her boots. "I just wanted to see her one last time before they shipped her off," Sarah said, looking at the F-22. "I spent more time in that cockpit than I did in my own house. I knew every rattle, every warning light. I knew exactly how she felt when she approached the sound barrier." She pulled her hands out of her pockets and looked at the angry red welts left by the zip ties. She rubbed her thumb over the bruised skin. "Turns out you can't go home again," she muttered. "Security gets jumpy." Hayes stepped directly in front of her. He pulled himself to attention. A sharp, rigid posture. It wasn't a casual stance between old friends. It was a commander addressing a superior. He snapped a textbook salute. Sharp, crisp, absolute respect. "It was an honor flying with you, Major," Hayes said, his voice thick. Sarah looked at him. The cynicism melted away for a brief, fleeting second. She saw the young A-10 pilot she had pulled out of the fire 2 decades ago. She saw the ghost of the life they had both survived. She didn't salute back. She was out of uniform. Instead, she reached out and rested her hand briefly on his shoulder. A purely human gesture. "Keep them flying, Bobby," she said softly. "Make sure they check that hydraulic actuator on the main gear. I wasn't kidding about the leak." She turned and started walking toward the hangar doors. Her limp was pronounced now, a heavy, dragging step against the polished concrete. She didn't look back. She walked out into the blinding glare of the July sun, her oversized gray sweater swallowing her frame, fading slowly into the dense heat haze rising off the tarmac. Hayes stood alone in the empty hangar. He looked at the massive, deadly machine resting in the shadows, then down at the concrete. A small puddle of hydraulic fluid was slowly expanding near the right main landing gear tire. He reached for his radio. "Maintenance, this is the base commander. I need a crew at Hangar 4. We've got a bleeder." He stayed right there until the mechanics arrived, standing guard over the empty jet. That's the reality of the people who give their lives to the sky. The machine gets retired and the pilot gets forgotten. If Sarah's story hit hard, hit the like button and subscribe for more grounded, hard-hitting dramas that show the real cost of service. What did you think of Colonel Hayes' reaction? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this video with someone who respects true, quiet strength. We'll see you in the next one.